My name is Linda. I'm 32 years old, and I thought I knew the man I married. 3 days ago, Gerald and I descended into what should have been the discovery of our careers. A pristine cave system hidden deep in Utah's wilderness. I'm a geologist, and these underground worlds have always felt like home to me. But as I sit here now, my hands still shaking from what happened in those depths, I realize that the most dangerous predator wasn't lurking in the shadows of the cave. It was sleeping next to me every night for 2 years. Before I share what happened in those dark depths, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust. Now let me take you back to the moment my world collapsed into something far darker than any cave I'd ever explored. Gerald and I met during our graduate studies at the University of Colorado. I was the serious one, always buried in geological surveys and rock samples, while he charmed professors with his easy smile and quick wit. But when it came to our shared passion for speleology, cave exploration, we were perfectly matched. Our first date was actually rappelling into Carlsbad Caverns after hours, something that should have gotten us expelled, but instead became the foundation of our love story. We spent 3 years building our relationship around shared dreams of discovery. Gerald proposed to me at the entrance of Mammoth Cave, saying he wanted to explore life's depths with me forever. Our wedding 2 years ago was small, but perfect, attended by fellow geologists and our families who'd grown used to our muddy boots and headlamps cluttering every surface. Dr. Samuel Richardson, my graduate advisor and mentor, had always been supportive of our partnership. So when he called 6 months ago with an opportunity that seemed almost too good to be true, we jumped at it. A new cave system had been discovered in southeastern Utah, completely untouched by human exploration. The landowner, an elderly rancher named Earl, had agreed to let a small research team have exclusive access for preliminary mapping and geological assessment. "This could be your breakthrough," Dr. Richardson told us during that fateful phone call. The initial geological surveys suggest formations that could be thousands of years old, possibly containing unique mineral deposits. But here's the catch. Earl wants minimal disruption. No large teams, no heavy equipment, just 2 qualified researchers for the initial assessment. Gerald's excitement was immediate and intense in a way that surprised me. Usually methodical about planning expeditions, he started pushing for us to leave within weeks rather than months. He insisted we take the most remote route to the site, arguing that we needed to respect Earl's wishes for minimal outside interference. When I suggested bringing backup communication equipment beyond our standard gear, Gerald dismissed it as unnecessary weight. "We're professionals, Linda," he said, with that confident smile I'd fallen in love with. "We've done dozens of these expeditions. This one's going to change everything for us." Looking back now, I realize Gerald was right about one thing. This expedition would change everything, just not in the way either of us expected or in the way I thought he meant at the time. The drive to Utah took 2 days winding through increasingly desolate landscape until we reached Earl's ranch. The old man was kind, but clearly eager to have minimal interaction with us. He pointed toward a series of rocky outcroppings about 5 miles from his house and told us the cave entrance was hidden among the formations. "Cell service out there is non-existent," Earl warned. "You'll be truly on your own until you come back. You sure you don't want me to check on you in a couple days?" Gerald quickly declined the offer, insisting we needed uninterrupted time for our research. As we loaded our gear and headed toward the site, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that I attributed to the significance of the discovery ahead of us. The cave entrance was even more impressive than Dr. Richardson's preliminary report had described. Hidden behind a cluster of juniper trees and weathered limestone, the opening appeared as a dark mouth in the earth, exhaling cool air that spoke of vast chambers below. My geological training immediately kicked in as I examined the rock formations surrounding the entrance, noting the clear evidence of water activity over millennia. Look at these limestone deposits, I said to Gerald, running my hands over the smooth stone. The way the water has carved these passages suggests this system could extend for miles underground. Gerald nodded, but I noticed he seemed more focused on our equipment check than on the geological features that usually fascinated him. He meticulously reviewed our rope system's headlamps and communication devices with an intensity that struck me as unusual. Gerald had always been safety conscious, but this felt different, almost obsessive. Our initial descent was breathtaking. The main chamber opened into a cathedral-like space with formations that took my breath away. Flowstone cascades frozen in limestone delicate soda straws, hanging like nature's chandeliers, and pools of crystal-clear water that reflected our headlamp beams like mirrors. This was exactly the kind of pristine environment that made my career choice feel like a calling rather than just a job. "We need to go deeper," Gerald said after we'd spent only 30 minutes in the main chamber. "The really significant formations are going to be in the lower levels." His urgency surprised me. Usually, we'd spend hours documenting and photographing each section before moving to new areas. But Gerald seemed driven by something I couldn't identify, checking his watch repeatedly and glancing toward passages that led deeper into the cave system. As we descended further, Gerald began asking strange questions that made me increasingly uncomfortable. "Linda, hypothetically, how long do you think someone could survive down here without outside help?" he asked as we navigated a particularly narrow passage. "What kind of question is that?" I responded, trying to keep my tone light. "Are you planning on getting us lost?" "Just curious about survival scenarios," he said. "You know, professional interest." But his tone didn't match his words. There was something calculating in his voice that made my skin crawl. Gerald had never shown interest in survival scenarios beyond standard safety protocols. His questions continued as we moved deeper. How long would our food last? What if our communication equipment failed? How well did I think our location was marked for potential rescue teams? My unease grew with each query, but I told myself I was being paranoid. This was Gerald, my husband, my research partner, the man who'd promised to explore life's depths with me. Surely my imagination was running wild in the alien environment of the cave. Then Gerald led me to a chamber I would never forget. It was smaller than the previous sections with only one clear entrance and exit. The walls curved inward, creating an almost egg-shaped space that felt both intimate and somehow menacing. Gerald's headlamp beams swept the area methodically, as if he was checking something specific. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is where we need to set up our detailed research station." Something in his voice made every instinct I'd developed over years of cave exploration scream that we needed to leave immediately. But I was still trapped by trust, still believing that the man I'd married couldn't possibly be leading me toward anything dangerous. The transformation in Gerald's behavior over the next hour was subtle but unmistakable. His responses to my geological observations became increasingly short and distracted. When I pointed out fascinating mineral formations that should have excited any researcher, he barely acknowledged them. Instead, he kept checking the chamber's exit measuring distances with his eyes and handling our equipment in ways that made no sense for standard cave exploration. "Gerald, what's wrong?" I finally asked directly. "You're acting strange, and it's making me nervous." For a moment, his familiar mask slipped completely. The man looking back at me had cold, calculating eyes that belonged to a stranger. Then he seemed to remember himself and attempted a smile that didn't reach those chilling eyes. "Just focused on the work, sweetheart," he said, but the endearment sounded forced and mechanical. That's when I noticed what he was doing with our backup communication device. Gerald was deliberately damaging the radio equipment using a rock to crack the casing in a way that would look like accidental damage. My professional training in emergency protocols made the sabotage obvious, but my emotional attachment to Gerald made me question what I was seeing. "Did you just break our radio?" I asked, my voice rising with panic. It must have gotten damaged during the descent, Gerald replied without looking at me. These things happen on expeditions. But I'd seen him deliberately strike the device. I'd watched him ensure our only reliable connection to the outside world was destroyed. The realization that my husband had intentionally cut off our ability to call for help sent ice through my veins that had nothing to do with the cave's natural temperature. Gerald, I want to leave. Now. My voice was steady, but inside every alarm bell was ringing. We can't leave yet, he said, his tone becoming firmer. We haven't completed our research objectives. What research objectives? You haven't taken a single meaningful sample or measurement since we've been down here. You've spent the entire time asking weird questions about survival, and now you've deliberately broken our communication equipment. I don't know what's going on, but we're leaving this cave right now. That's when Gerald finally stopped pretending. His shoulders straightened. His expression hardened, and when he looked at me, I saw something that made my blood freeze. He was looking at me like I was already dead. No, Linda, he said quietly. We're not leaving. At least, I'm leaving. You're staying here. The words hung in the air between us like poison. My mind struggled to process what he'd said. Rejection and disbelief, warring with the growing evidence that the man I'd trusted with my life was about to take it from me. What are you talking about? I whispered. Gerald reached into his pack and pulled out a manila folder I'd never seen before. Inside were documents that made my world collapse, life insurance policies taken out on me without my knowledge, paperwork showing beneficiaries I'd never approved, and medical records that had been falsified to suggest I had health conditions that made me a higher risk for accidental death during cave exploration. I've been planning this for months, Gerald said with terrifying calm. The affair with Janet started last year. We want to be together, but divorce would mean splitting everything, including the research grants and equipment that are all in both our names. This way is cleaner. Janet. My best friend Janet, who'd helped me choose my wedding dress, who'd been my maid of honor, who'd listened to me talk about my marriage troubles, and offered comfort and advice. The betrayal was so complete, so thorough, that I actually felt physical pain in my chest. You're going to murder me for insurance money and my best friend. The words came out as a croak. It won't be murder, Gerald said, as if explaining a simple geological process. It'll be a tragic accident, a cave-in maybe, or getting lost in the passages. These things happen to even experienced cavers. Everyone will believe it because everyone knows how dangerous this work can be. He began moving toward the chamber's exit, picking up rocks along the way. Large, heavy stones that he started placing across the opening with methodical precision. Each rock that blocked more of the exit felt like another nail in my coffin. Gerald, please. I begged, my professional composure completely shattered. We can work this out. If you want a divorce, if you want to be with Janet, we can figure something out that doesn't involve killing me. I've already filed the insurance claims, he said without pausing in his work. I reported you missing 3 hours ago, told them there was a collapse and I barely escaped. The story's already in motion. The rocks continued to pile up, reducing the opening from a passage a person could walk through to a gap barely large enough for air circulation. My headlamp beam caught Gerald's face as he worked, and I saw something that will haunt me forever. He looked satisfied, almost pleased with his efficiency. These rocks should keep you warm, Gerald whispered as he placed the final stones, sealing me into what he intended to be my tomb. The sound of his footsteps fading away left me in a silence more complete than anything I'd ever experienced. The darkness that surrounded me wasn't just the absence of light, it was the absence of hope, trust, and everything I'd believed about the person I'd chosen to share my life with. The first hour after Gerald sealed the chamber was pure panic. I screamed until my throat was raw, threw myself against the rock barrier until my shoulders were bruised and bleeding, and called his name with increasingly desperate pleas that echoed mockingly in the confined space. The reality of my situation crashed over me in waves. I was buried alive, trapped by the person who was supposed to protect me, with no one in the world knowing where I really was. Hyperventilation set in as the full weight of betrayal and terror overwhelmed my nervous system. My breathing became rapid and shallow, making the limited air supply feel even more precious. For several minutes, I genuinely thought I might die from panic alone, which Gerald had probably counted on. The psychological torture of the situation was almost worse than the physical danger. But my professional training eventually kicked in, probably saving my life. Years of cave exploration had taught me to assess dangerous situations methodically, and my geological education had given me knowledge that Gerald didn't realize might be useful. I forced myself to slow my breathing to think like a scientist rather than a victim. Using my phone's flashlight to preserve my headlamp batteries, I began a systematic examination of my prison. The chamber was roughly 12 feet by 8 feet with a ceiling that varied from 7 to 9 feet high. The walls showed clear evidence of water activity, which meant there had to be drainage somewhere, even if it wasn't immediately visible. That's when I found the stream. Hidden behind a formation of flowstone in the chamber's far corner, a thin trickle of water disappeared into a crack in the floor. The crack was narrow, maybe 6 inches wide, but it represented something Gerald hadn't accounted for. Water always finds a way out. Taking inventory of what Gerald had left behind revealed both encouraging and devastating facts. He'd taken most of our food and all of our rope, but in his hurry to execute his plan, he'd left behind some crucial items: my geological hammer, a small pick, several sample bags, and most importantly, my phone with its detailed GPS logging of our route into the cave. The water source solved my immediate survival concern, but I realized I had maybe 2 days of food in the energy bars and trail mix that remained. If I was going to survive, I needed to find another way out, and I needed to find it quickly. The crack where the water disappeared became my focus. Using my geological hammer and pick, I began carefully chipping away at the limestone around the opening. The rock was softer than I'd initially thought, carved by centuries of water flow into formations that could be widened with the right tools and enough determination. After 6 hours of careful work, I'd enlarged the crack enough to get my head and shoulders through. My phone's flashlight revealed that the narrow passage opened into a larger space below part of a cave system that Gerald either didn't know about or had chosen to ignore in his planning. The crawl through that enlarged crack was the most claustrophobic experience of my life. For several terrifying minutes, I was convinced I'd gotten stuck and would die wedged between rocks like some horrible parody of birth in reverse. But geological knowledge that had seemed purely academic suddenly became survival skills as I used my understanding of rock formation and structural integrity to navigate the passage safely. Emerging into the lower chamber felt like resurrection. This space was larger than my prison above, with multiple passages leading in different directions. More importantly, I could feel air movement, which meant connection to the surface somewhere in the system. But I was also deeper underground than I'd ever been, alone with no backup, no communication, and no one in the world who would be looking for me in the right place. Gerald's head start meant that by now he'd probably convinced everyone that I was dead, buried under tons of rock from a tragic collapse. The irony wasn't lost on me. The geological knowledge that had brought Gerald and me together was now the only thing that might save me from his betrayal. Navigating the lower cave system alone tested every skill I'd learned over years of speleological training. Without Gerald's support, which I now realized had always been tainted by his hidden agenda, I had to rely entirely on my own judgment about safe passage routes and structural stability. Every decision could mean the difference between finding freedom and creating my own tomb in a cave-in. The passages varied wildly in size and character. Some opened into chambers large enough to hold a house, while others narrowed to crawlways that forced me to move on my belly like a snake. My geological training helped me read the rock formations for clues about water flow and structural integrity, knowledge that became crucial as I faced passages that could either lead to freedom or deeper into a maze with no exit. Hours passed in a blur of careful navigation and growing exhaustion. My phone's battery was draining faster than I'd hoped, and I had to ration my use of its flashlight. The headlamp provided more efficient illumination, but I knew its battery life was limited too. In true cave exploration, you always have backup lighting systems, but Gerald had made sure I had only basic equipment. The most challenging obstacle came about 4 hours into my underground journey, a vertical shaft that rose nearly 40 feet toward what appeared to be natural light far above. This represented both my best hope for escape and my most dangerous challenge. Without proper climbing equipment, ascending 40 feet of rock face could easily result in a fall that would leave me injured and helpless. But I'd noticed something Gerald had either missed or ignored. The shaft walls showed clear evidence of ancient handholds carved by water flow over millennia. Natural ledges and protrusions created what experienced climbers call a natural ladder, challenging but potentially climbable for someone with the right knowledge and desperate enough motivation. Using my geological hammer as a climbing tool, I began the most terrifying ascent of my life. Each handhold had to be tested carefully for stability. Each foothold required trusting my weight to formations that might crumble under pressure. The physical demands were enormous, but the psychological challenge was even greater. One mistake would mean falling to certain death, with no one ever knowing how I'd really died. Halfway up the shaft, my strength began failing. My arms shook from exhaustion, and my legs cramped from the unnatural climbing positions. For several minutes, I hung against the rock face, convinced I couldn't continue, but knowing that climbing down was just as dangerous as going up. That's when I heard it, the sound of wind moving through the shaft above me. Real wind carrying scents of sage and juniper that meant the surface was closer than I dared hope. The smell of the outside world gave me strength I didn't know I still possessed. The final 15 feet of the climb required techniques I'd only read about in mountaineering manuals. Using a method called chimneying, I wedged my back against one wall of the shaft and my feet against the opposite wall, then walked my way up by moving my back and feet alternately. It was exhausting and terrifying, but it worked. Emerging from the shaft felt like being reborn. I found myself in a completely different location from where Gerald and I had entered the cave system, probably 3 miles away, based on the terrain features I could recognize. The sun was setting, painting the Utah landscape in colors that seemed impossibly beautiful after the gray limestone world below. But I was also dehydrated, exhausted, and lost in wilderness with no immediate way to contact help. Gerald's plan had failed, but I was still far from safe. The hike toward civilization tested my endurance in ways that made the cave escape seem easy by comparison. Dehydration had left me weak and disoriented, while the emotional trauma of Gerald's betrayal created a psychological fog that made decision-making difficult. Every step across the rough Utah terrain was a reminder that I was completely alone in a hostile environment. Using landmarks and my geological knowledge of the area, I oriented myself toward where I believed Earl's ranch should be located. The setting sun provided directional guidance, but it also meant I'd soon be navigating in darkness across unfamiliar ground. My phone had died hours earlier, taking with it both my flashlight and GPS capabilities. After walking for what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes, I encountered the first sign of human activity: tire tracks in the sandy soil that looked recent. Following these tracks led me to a dirt road that had to connect eventually to the main highway. But the road stretched in both directions toward horizons I couldn't see, and choosing the wrong direction could mean walking away from help instead of toward it. That's when I heard the engine. A Park Service truck was heading toward me, driven by two rangers who looked shocked to see a muddy, exhausted woman walking alone in the middle of nowhere. Ranger Patricia Williams and Ranger Dennis Koch became my unlikely saviors, though their initial confusion quickly turned to alarm as I tried to explain my situation. "Ma'am, are you Linda Martinez?" Ranger Williams asked. "Because if you are, you're supposed to be dead." The words hit me like ice water. Gerald's plan had worked exactly as he'd intended. He'd already reported my death, probably collected sympathy from friends and colleagues, and begun the process of claiming insurance money. In the eyes of the world, I was already a victim of a tragic caving accident. "Your husband reported a cave collapse yesterday," Ranger Koch explained as they gave me water and emergency medical attention. "He said you were caught in a rock fall and he barely escaped himself. There's been a search and rescue operation planned, but they were treating it as body recovery, not rescue." The Rangers' radio crackled with communications from their dispatch, and I heard my own name mentioned in reports about victim recovery and family notification. Gerald had been thorough in his deception, creating a timeline and story that made my death seem not just plausible, but inevitable. "I need you to understand," I told the Rangers with as much clarity as I could manage. "My husband didn't escape from a cave collapse. He trapped me in that cave on purpose. He sealed the entrance with rocks and left me to die. This was attempted murder, not an accident." The Rangers exchanged glances that told me they were struggling to process what I was telling them. Gerald's story had been convincing enough that multiple agencies were treating this as a standard cave rescue operation gone tragic. My survival and completely different version of events turned everything upside down. Ranger Williams began documenting my account with careful notes, while Ranger Koch called for additional medical support and police response. As I detailed Gerald's behavior, the insurance documents I'd seen, and the deliberate way he'd sealed the chamber, I could see the Rangers' expressions change from confusion to alarm to anger. "We need to get you to a hospital," Ranger Williams said. "But first, can you show us where you emerged from the cave system? This could be crucial evidence." Despite my exhaustion, I guided them back to the shaft opening I'd climbed through. The Rangers documented the location with GPS coordinates and photographs, creating the first pieces of evidence that would eventually destroy Gerald's carefully constructed lie. During the drive to the hospital, Ranger Koch's radio brought news that made my blood run cold. Gerald was at that very moment giving interviews to local news stations about his tragic loss and accepting condolences from our geological community. He'd played the grieving widower so convincingly that donations were being collected for a memorial scholarship in my name. The scope of Gerald's deception was breathtaking in its thoroughness. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated my geological knowledge and my determination to survive. The next 72 hours unfolded like a dramatic reversal of everything Gerald had planned. While I recovered in the hospital from dehydration and minor injuries, law enforcement began unraveling his elaborate scheme with methodical precision. Detective Maria Santos, assigned to the case, later told me that my survival had given them something rare in attempted murder cases: a living victim who could provide detailed testimony about premeditation and motive. The first break came when investigators examined the cave site where Gerald claimed the collapse had occurred. Geological experts immediately recognized that the rock placement was artificial, not the result of natural cave-in activity. The stones had been deliberately stacked to block the passage, and tool marks on several rocks indicated human manipulation rather than natural shifting. Meanwhile, Gerald's behavior during his grief raised red flags with investigators who'd seen similar cases. His eagerness to discuss insurance payouts, his detailed knowledge of the claims process, and his immediate inquiries about when he could access my accounts created a pattern that experienced detectives recognized as suspicious. The most damaging evidence came from Gerald's own digital footprint. Investigators discovered that he'd been researching cave accident statistics, survival timelines in underground environments, and life insurance claim procedures for months before our expedition. His computer history showed searches for accidental death cave exploration, how long can someone survive trapped underground, and life insurance payout timeline accidental death. Even more incriminating were the communications between Gerald and Janet that investigators uncovered. Text messages, emails, and social media interactions painted a clear picture of their affair and their discussions about getting rid of me. Janet had even helped Gerald research the insurance policies and had been present when he'd forged my signature on several documents. When Detective Santos showed me printouts of some of these communications, I felt sick. Messages like, "Linda's so focused on her rocks she'd never see it coming," and "After the accident, we can finally be together without complications," revealed a level of callousness that made me question how I'd ever trusted either of them. The media attention surrounding my resurrection became intense and overwhelming. News outlets picked up the story of the geologist who'd escaped her husband's murder plot, and suddenly, I was fielding interview requests from national television programs. Gerald's public portrayal of himself as a grieving widower made the revelation of his true intentions even more shocking to people who'd believed his performance. Dr. Richardson, my mentor, visited me in the hospital with tears in his eyes. "I recommended that expedition," he said. "If I'd known what Gerald was planning, I would never have put you in danger." But the support from my professional community was overwhelming. Colleagues from across the country reached out with offers of assistance, new research opportunities, and messages of solidarity. The geological community is close-knit, and news of Gerald's betrayal sent shockwaves through networks of researchers who'd known us both. Gerald's arrest came on my third day in the hospital. Detective Santos showed me the booking photo. The confident, charming man I'd married looked haggard and defeated, finally forced to face consequences for his actions. The charges were extensive: attempted murder, insurance fraud, filing false police reports, and conspiracy. Janet was arrested the same day. Her cooperation with investigators in exchange for reduced charges provided additional evidence of Gerald's premeditation and planning. During her interrogation, she revealed details about their relationship and Gerald's growing obsession with finding a way to eliminate me without losing access to my research grants and equipment. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving prosecutors time to build their case and giving me time to process the emotional devastation of discovering how thoroughly the two people I'd trusted most had betrayed me. But the legal process was just beginning. The real challenge would be rebuilding my life after having my fundamental understanding of trust and safety shattered by the people closest to me. The trial began 8 months after my escape from the cave, and those months had been a journey of healing that was almost as challenging as the physical survival I'd endured underground. Therapy sessions with Dr. Rebecca Chen, a specialist in trauma recovery, helped me understand that Gerald's betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth or judgment, but rather a consequence of his own moral failures and psychological problems. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney James Patterson, built their case methodically around the evidence that had accumulated since my rescue. The artificial rock placement in the cave, Gerald's digital history of research into my death, his communications with Janet about their plans, and the forged insurance documents created an overwhelming picture of premeditation and malice. Gerald's defense team attempted to portray the incident as a misunderstanding, claiming that he genuinely believed I'd been killed in an accidental collapse and had simply panicked. But the evidence was too extensive and too detailed to support any explanation other than deliberate attempted murder. My testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. Facing Gerald across the courtroom, I recounted every detail of our expedition, his strange behavior, the revelation of his affair and insurance plans, and the methodical way he'd sealed me into what he'd intended as my tomb. Throughout my testimony, Gerald avoided eye contact, but I could see the jury's reactions to the calculated nature of his betrayal. Janet's testimony as a cooperating witness provided crucial corroboration of the prosecution's timeline. She detailed conversations where Gerald had discussed various methods of killing me, ultimately settling on the cave plan because it would be most likely to appear accidental. Her obvious remorse and cooperation didn't excuse her participation, but it helped establish the depth of Gerald's planning and manipulation. The insurance companies had conducted their own investigations and testified about the suspicious timing and amounts of the policies Gerald had taken out on my life. The total value was nearly $800,000 money that would have allowed Gerald and Janet to fund their new life together while maintaining the research lifestyle they'd wanted. Expert testimony from geologists and cave rescue specialists confirmed that the rock placement blocking my escape route could not have occurred naturally. Dr. Michael Torres, a speleologist with 30 years of experience, testified that the pattern and stability of the rock barrier showed clear evidence of human engineering designed to prevent escape while maintaining just enough air circulation to prolong death rather than cause immediate suffocation. The most powerful moment of the trial came during victim impact statements. I stood before the court and spoke directly to Gerald about what his betrayal had cost me, not just the physical danger and trauma, but the destruction of my ability to trust, the violation of every promise he'd made during our marriage, and the knowledge that someone I'd loved had been planning my death while sharing my bed. "You didn't just try to kill my body," I told him. "You tried to kill my spirit, my trust in human goodness, and my belief that love means safety. But I survived your cave, and I survived your betrayal, and I'm here to make sure you face justice for what you tried to do." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Gerald was sentenced to 25 years to life for attempted murder, with additional time for the fraud and conspiracy charges. Janet received 8 years as part of her plea agreement. The civil lawsuit against Gerald and the insurance companies resulted in a settlement that covered my medical expenses, therapy costs, and lost income while also establishing a legal precedent about coverage for attempted murder by spouses. But the real victory wasn't the legal judgment or the financial settlement. It was walking out of that courtroom knowing that I'd not only survived Gerald's attempt to destroy me, but that I'd found the strength to fight back and ensure he couldn't do this to anyone else. 2 years have passed since I climbed out of that cave shaft and back into my life, and the healing process has been more complex than I ever imagined possible. The physical recovery from dehydration and injuries was straightforward compared to rebuilding my emotional foundation after having my core beliefs about trust and safety completely shattered. The early months were dominated by what my therapist called hypervigilance, an exhausting state where my nervous system treated every relationship and situation as potentially dangerous. Simple interactions like meeting new colleagues or going on casual dates felt loaded with the possibility of betrayal. I found myself analyzing every conversation for hidden meanings, every gesture for signs of deception. But gradually, with professional help and the support of genuine friends, I began to distinguish between reasonable caution and paralyzing fear. Dr. Rebecca Chen helped me understand that healing didn't mean returning to my previous level of trust, but rather developing more sophisticated abilities to recognize authenticity and red flags in relationships. My career in geology actually flourished in ways I hadn't expected. The publicity from the trial, while initially overwhelming, led to speaking opportunities at conferences about both cave safety and domestic violence awareness. I discovered that my professional expertise, combined with my survival experience, created a unique platform for educating others about recognizing manipulation and danger signs in relationships. Dr. Richardson offered me a research position that didn't require cave exploration, understanding that my relationship with underground environments had become complicated. But after months of therapy and gradual exposure, I realized that avoiding caves entirely would mean letting Gerald's betrayal define the rest of my professional life. Instead, I developed new safety protocols and never explored alone, reclaiming my passion for geology while acknowledging the trauma I'd experienced. The geological community's support never wavered. Colleagues who'd known Gerald were shocked by his actions, but rallied around me with offers of collaboration research opportunities and genuine friendships that helped restore my faith in human decency. I learned that the problem wasn't my judgment of character, but rather Gerald's skill at deception and manipulation. Dating again required incredible courage and patience. My first serious relationship after Gerald was with Robert, a fellow researcher who understood the importance of transparency and patience as I navigated trust issues. While that relationship ultimately didn't lead to marriage, it taught me that it was possible to love again without completely abandoning the wisdom I'd gained from surviving betrayal. The legal resolution provided closure, but didn't erase the emotional impact. Gerald's 25-year sentence ensured he couldn't harm me or anyone else for decades, but I still occasionally had nightmares about being trapped in dark spaces. Therapy helped me develop coping strategies, and the nightmares became less frequent over time. Janet sent me a letter from prison 2 years after the trial, attempting to apologize and explain her actions. I chose not to respond, recognizing that forgiveness was something I needed to do for my own healing, not something she was entitled to receive. Forgiveness, I learned, didn't require reconciliation or even communication with the people who'd wronged me. The most profound change has been in my understanding of strength and vulnerability. I used to think that trusting people fully was a sign of strength, while caution was weakness. Now I understand that real strength lies in being able to remain open to genuine connection while maintaining enough self-awareness and boundaries to protect yourself from those who would exploit your trust. I still explore caves, but never alone, and always with people I've grown to trust through time and shared experiences. The underground world that was nearly my tomb has become once again a source of wonder and discovery, though I'll never take its dangers lightly. Most importantly, I've learned that survival isn't just about escaping immediate physical danger. It's about refusing to let someone else's cruelty define your future relationships, your career choices, or your fundamental belief in the possibility of genuine human connection. I learned that the deepest caves aren't underground. They're the ones people hide in their hearts. Sometimes the darkness shows us who people really are, but it also reveals our own strength. I survived not just because I knew geology, but because I refused to let someone else's betrayal define my worth. Trust is like a cave system. It takes time to explore, but once you know the safe passages, you can navigate even in the dark. The difference now is that I understand the importance of having multiple exits and never exploring the depths with someone whose motivations I haven't carefully examined. If you've experienced betrayal by someone you trusted, I want you to know that survival is possible, healing is real, and your ability to trust again doesn't make you naive. It makes you brave. What happened to me in that cave changed everything about how I understand relationships and safety. But it didn't destroy my capacity for hope or connection. Have you ever had to rebuild trust after a major betrayal? How did you find the courage to remain open to genuine relationships? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please like this video if my story resonated with you. Subscribe for more stories about survival and resilience, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that escape and healing are always possible, even from the darkest places. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that your strength is greater than any cave someone else tries to trap you in. Stay safe, stay strong, and never stop believing in your ability to find your way back to the light.